2 million years ago, I told you I was gonna film a video showing you my neutral indie palettes. Well, the time has finally come because I apologize. It's been too long, okay? It's been 84 years. But I decided to go through my entire collection and grab the indie palettes that I have in my collection that are more on the neutral and what I would like to call spicy neutral spectrum. There's going to be a couple of palettes here that I think that not all of you will agree with me that they're neutral palettes. But how I did when I chose these palettes, it's that I want at least half of the shades in the palette, more than half of the shades in the palette, to be considered neutral had they been in an all brown palette, like to be considered neutral. And then there are some like maybe a little bit more slightly too many colors. You'll see. I'm gonna bend the rules with a couple of these products. I will link all the products down below in the description box in case you're interested in these palettes. This video is made after request from you because I know a lot of people out there really want to dive into indie brands, but you might not be into those really bright and colorful things that usually comes with indie brands, because indie brands, they don't have to adhere to a lot of rules that comes with what sells at Ulta, what sells at Sephora, what do retailers want to have in their stores. They can just bend the rules and produce whatever they want, because a lot of times they can get something into production quicker, and they can also discontinue something quicker, and they can produce smaller batches and all of that. And all of that plays into being able to not have to play so much by the rules. But I'm gonna go into these palettes without any kind of order, but I am gonna take them by brand. And I'm just gonna tell you what I think about these, who I think it could be good for, and like I said, all the details will be in the description box. Let's actually start with Fantasy Cosmetica. This is the Fighter palette, and to me, this is an all neutral palette. There is a little bit of a mustard here. I think a mustard is a neutral. I do have a golden undertone, so for me, a mustard really, I can really blur out a mustard into my skin tone because of my undertone. If you have a cooler undertone, if you have a pink undertone, if you have a peach undertone, of course a mustard is gonna look a little bit more brighter. Same with like some other colors, like pinks, for example, is always going to look a little bit more brighter on me than it would on someone that has a pink undertone. I feel like all of this is like color theory that somewhat makes sense when we start to think about it. But I think that this is a pretty good alternative to a neutral palette that has a couple of like shifts in the shimmers, but still is very much on the neutral side. There are some cool tones, there are some warm tones, but overall I would call this a spicy neutral palette. On first glance, it's a neutral palette, but there's definitely some different fun things going on here. I do also have some affiliate codes with some of these brands, and when I do, I will pop them up on the screen and you can see my affiliate code is always Angeshka. You can always try that at an indie brand. If you're making an order, you can get some money off with your order, but I will also leave that down below. The next one I want to talk about, what is this officially called? This is the Elemental Blast Geo palette, and this is by Game Beauty. They did come out with a couple of these monochromatic palettes some years ago, and this is the one that is the Geo palette. It is inspired by Earth. There was different elements. I quite recently did a look for my members. I do have a membership here on my channel. If you want to join in and see more tutorials, or if you just want to support the channel a bit, that's also down below in the description box or the button next to the subscribe button. I did do a look with the green palette, which was the Dendro palette then, but this is the one that is the more neutral palette. But again, you can see it's like a pop of that more like yellowy tones, and for me, I think that yellows together with browns, it's such an amazing way of getting spicy neutrals, just something a little bit more exciting. I really like this palette. It's been a while since I talked about this one, so it's nice to show it. Then we have the Ultimate Cappuccino palette by Dede Signature. This one, again, now we're bending the rules a little bit, but this is also described as a neutral palette by the brand. The brand has described this as a neutral palette, and I would argue that more than half of the shades are considered neutrals. Then there is like those more bright pops here, like a pink, an orange, and a yellow. Again, depending on your undertone, blending browns into these shades could really make sense for like blurring out the edges. And then there is this pop of like this duochrome, very sparkly metallic, like jade green down here. That is a really nice like pop. Honestly, I think this palette is really beautiful, and I really have loved working with this one. This is definitely not an all neutral palette, but again, I do think that it fits into the category of neutral palettes. I have two different palettes here by GlossGods, which is a Swedish indie brand, and if you are living in the EU and you don't want to pay any import fees or anything like that, definitely suggest checking out GlossGods, my code works with them as well. This is their newest neutral palette. This one came out around Christmas, I think, and this is called the Molten Metals. This is a very fun concept because it's a row of mattes and a row of very intense, again, molten metallics, very high intensity. And if you are into just, you want to try those very high intensity metallics, but you're not into maybe the multi-chromes, you don't want to try the colorful shadows, I definitely just suggest checking this one out because it's giving really interesting things. If you want to try something that has a little bit of different tones, then this one is called Let's Get Nude. This is a little bit more of a peachy neutral palette, and here a lot of the shimmers have a more or less of a multi-chrome appeal to it. This is definitely in the category of spicy neutrals because at first glance this is definitely neutrals, but like I said, a bunch of these metallics do have some different fun shifts to them, duochromes, multi-chromes, some more obvious than others, and it definitely gives you something different on the eyes. But then there's a couple of those here that are just a very high intensity, like neutral metallic, and I think that this one gives options depending on in what direction you want to go. Again, if you're looking for neutrals but just unexpected. Ooh, I said I was gonna do by brand, but I kind of forgot, but I will put this together with Fantasy Cosmetica down below because this is another Fantasy Cosmetica palette. This is the collaboration that they did with Amanda at Makeup Just for Fun. This is called Enchanted Autumn. I want to make sure that I say the right thing. And Amanda is a little bit more into like grungy, neutral fall colors, and that's definitely the color scheme that this palette has. I think that this one, it's almost like you took a colorful palette, but you pull the saturation down to the point that it turns into a grungy neutral palette. It's a very interesting palette. Again, if you're the kind of person that want to try some indie palettes, you are the person that mostly wear neutrals, but you want to branch out a little bit, I feel like this one is, for me who loves really colorful looks, this is more of a neutral palette. But if you only wear brown shadows, this will definitely be more of a muted colorful palette. So this I feel is in that like mystical land in between a neutral and a colorful palette, and I think a lot of people would really appreciate this. It's really, really, really good quality. Sigma is a bigger indie brand, and they came up with this one last year. It is called the Cool Neutrals palette. I always save these little plastic ones from Sigma because they're so beautiful. I also have the brush in here. I saved everything. This is a very nice neutral palette that has a mix between cool tones and warm tones, and the metallics are really nice in here. They did update the metallics to be even better for this palette, and I think that this is a really pretty palette. Again, Sigma is a bigger indie brand. You can find them at a bunch of different retailers as well. If you don't want to buy directly from a brand, maybe Sigma again can be that in between indie brand where it is technically an indie brand and they do take some more risks with their products, but they're also sold at a bunch of different retailers. So maybe for some people that feels more safe. That's like up for you to decide, but I really enjoyed this neutral palette. This one again is more intense than some things you would find at Sephora and Ulta, but maybe not as intense, and I don't want to say special because I feel like that's the wrong word to use, but maybe not like those duochrome, multichromes, unexpected spicy twists as you will see in some of these other ones. One brand that doesn't do a lot of neutral palettes, and I will say, do I even think that this is a neutral palette? Some of you are going to be like, absolutely not, but that is Glamlite. And I do have the Garfield palette here. This is one of my favorite palettes actually from Glamlite. I think that they make amazing eyeshadows, but they don't always make amazing eyeshadows. I feel like Glamlite, you kind of have to like watch a review before you buy something, and this one, amazing quality. Is it a neutral palette? It's kind of spicy, okay? There's a bunch of red tones in here, but there also is a bunch of browns, golds, a more muted champagnes. There is a more like, almost like a storm cloud blue in here, and then there is this muted, like almost champagne that goes into a purple, which again, like a little bit more of a different twist to a neutral metallic. I really like this palette, and you definitely can go neutral with this palette. And back in 2016, 2015, 2017, something that had like bright reds and oranges and yellows, we would have called that a warm neutral. So that's why I think that this is like it's tethering on the edge of what could be considered a neutral. Same with Oden's Eye. Oden's Eye doesn't really do a lot of neutral palettes, and I honestly think that they should. I think that Oden's Eye should do a neutral palette because I feel like people would appreciate that. This one is the Stone and Rock, and I think this is the closest to a neutral palette that they have ever done. And this is, I would say, a half neutrals and a half like greens. A lot of the greens are very muted, but then we have a couple of more poppy greens in here. There is a black, there is a white, and there is a bunch of more like muted earthy tones. If you have an olive undertone and if you again are looking for something that's in between a neutral and a colorful palette, I think this might be your best friend, quite honestly. This is my favorite palette from Oden's Eye, except the ones that I created myself, because of course I'm a little bit biased and I do prefer those, even though they're actually sold out now and now not available any longer. But from the available palettes that Oden's Eye has, this is my favorite one, which is kind of telling for where I am right now with my colors. I love these kind of like I say as I'm wearing a mint look, but these kind of like grungy and muted. I love these kind of colors. I'm really into that right now. And I feel like this one is as neutral as Oden's Eye has gone, but I still feel like it's in the cards for them to go even more neutral. And I wonder if that's gonna happen. I feel like that could happen. Clarity Cosmetics just recently came out with a palette that's very neutral, and this is a re-release of an older neutral palette. This is I Love Coffee, and it has only like brown shades. This is if you want to try indie brands, but you don't want multichromes, you don't want those crazy flaky shades, you are not looking for anything that's not browns, you just want to have browns, and you just want to, you know, try the indie quality, because this is pigmented, the metallics are very foily, there is an iridescent topper here, but it's not like, this isn't a spicy neutral palette. This is a neutral palette, if that is what you're looking for. I will mention a couple of others in a bit as well, but this is more like if you only wear browns, but you still want to try a neutral palette, I would say that this one could be for you. Another brand that doesn't really do neutral palettes, but when they have been really good, is Blend Bunny Cosmetics. This, again, I think this might be my favorite palette from Blend Bunny, but it's because I feel when brands that do really interesting and colorful and just more exciting and rule-breaking palettes, when they do a neutral palette, they usually do it very good and very interesting. So this is the Blend Bunny neutral palette that they have. It's a row of like, again, gray, white, black, silver, browns, more bricky, like reddish browns, mustards, and then like a cool toned olive. This is interesting, mind-bending, exciting, spicy neutrals that you look at this palette and this is a neutral palette, but it's like a neutral palette that you will not find at Sephora, Ulta, or any of the department stores. It's just different undertones, different composition, and this will give you so many different looks and undertones and stuff that you will not get from the palettes that are sold at mainstream brands. I highly recommend this one. I absolutely love it, and I'm so excited to see that the brand is still selling this one. Lunar Beauty is a brand that actually has a bunch of neutral palettes. Lunar Beauty is owned by Manny MUA, so this is an indie brand. It is self-funded, but it's also an influencer brand. An indie brand is a brand that is like independently owned. There's no big financiers, there is no umbrella brand. It's just something that is controlled solely by usually like one person or one family or like a group. It's not like a bunch of different brands that are stirring the pot and making decisions. And Manny does own his brand. It is self-funded, but Manny also loves neutral. So if you want to try an indie brand, you want to try like more metallics or interesting stuff or very pigmented mattes, I definitely think that Lunar Beauty could be a good brand to try. I actually got rid of the Nude Prism palette. This is a more lighter peachy neutral palette. Again, if you love peachy neutrals and you want to try an indie brand, this is a very high quality palette, and I know a bunch of people really love this palette. Again, look at my eye look. This wasn't a palette that I reached for a lot, so I gave it away to a friend who's hopefully having a bunch more fun with it than I ever did. But I do still have the collab that he did with Laura Lee Los Angeles, which is a brand that's no longer available. Otherwise, they had some neutral things as well, because again, Laura Lee also loves neutrals. But this is the Full Fantasy, which they did as a collab together with each other to celebrate the podcast that they have. And this is what I would call a more interesting neutral palette without having a bunch of those different like shifts and multi-chromes. There is, I think, 2 duochromes in here, or maybe just 1, but this is a high quality palette that goes from light to dark. It is some more berry tones, there is a little olive, there is browns and like more peachy leaning browns, but overall this is a neutral palette with some interesting undertones and a lot of variation, and I think that this is an amazingly made neutral palette. If you love neutrals, you want to try indie brand, I definitely think that this palette could be a good suggestion. It is still available on their website. If you love something that is a little bit more smoky, a little darker, a little bit more mysterious, and if you love the idea of having a palette that can make darker looks and that also has some really interesting metallics, this is the Eternal Eclipse. This is one of the older palettes from the brand, but they're still producing it and selling it on the website. This is a very interesting brand. And it does have 2 blues down here as well, which you can definitely do an all blue look with. I have done that. There's a very interesting foily metallics in here. There is like grays, there is a sparkly black. The mattes in the middle row are really nice neutral mattes that I think are just a beautiful undertone, and overall I've really enjoyed this palette a lot. I think this is a beautiful palette, and before they released the Moonshroom thing that they had, which is like a colorful palette, that's not a neutral palette, this was my favorite palette from the brand, but now my favorite is the Moonshroom palette, but that is definitely not a neutral palette, but that is a great palette too. Unearthly Cosmetics is another brand that doesn't really have a lot of neutral palettes, but I do think the most neutral palette that they have is the Sorcerous Smoke palette, and I think this is again it's like a palette that if you would have turned up the saturation, it would have been seen as a little bit more of a colorful palette because of the muted greens. There is this almost like dark smoky purple duochrome here, and then there are some browns and this like very muted peach. But I think that this is a neutral palette because of the desaturation of the whole shebang. And this is a beautiful palette. Unearthly Cosmetics makes really high quality shadows, and they do have so many different palettes to choose from, especially if you like more colorful things. But if you wanted to try the brand and you're unsure of where to begin and you mostly wear neutrals, I would say that the Sorcerous Smoke is definitely where to begin. This is me bending the rules a little bit, but I think that this one would be considered as a spicy neutral palette with a couple of pops of color, and this is the BellaPoizon Garden. They did re-release this palette last year, and they just reworked a little bit of the colors and the packaging. And this is, I mean, if you cover the 2 blues, I would say that this is a pretty grungy neutral palette. The 2 blues here is like a pop of those like really bright blues. This one has very interesting holographic metallics. It has some multi-chromes and duochromes in here. This is very much a grungy, spicy neutral palette with a lot of different twists and a lot of different shadows that you don't really know what you get until you swatch it or until you put it on the lid. But if you only wear neutrals and you want to see what are those special shadows about, this is the one. This is where you start. And you can get some money off with this palette. I will link it down below. But I highly recommend this one if you love neutrals, but you want to try some special shadows, you want to get a good mix of mattes and shimmers. Bella Beauté Bar makes amazing quality eyeshadows, and I definitely recommend this one. Even if you don't like the blues, it's only 2 shadows. They're magnetic as well. You can change them out for something else, but I really do like the blues though. I think they're making a really fun pop into this palette, but this one is a really nice one. Now I'm going to mention one from Glaminatrix, and they made this palette as a spicy neutral palette, and this is actually one of the palettes that got me thinking about the different indie neutral palettes that I have in my collection, and this is called the Barely Basic palette. Glaminatrix Cosmetics is an Australian indie brand, so if you are living in Australia, you can definitely get this even easier. This one has 3 rows of neutrals. It's like a cool tone brown, it's a warm tone brown, and it's more like a berry neutral mauve thing, and then there's an olive green, and then there's 2 rows of metallics. These 3 are more like foily metallics that cover the lids. One of them is more of a green shift in it, and then you have 3 iridescent toppers. It's like a champagne, a mint, a peach, and a pink. Again, neutrals with a twist. These are very different kind of neutrals. You can go fully neutral, but you can also wear some of these toppers and get a brighter look. Again, if you like neutrals but you want to see what are those indie shadows about, I definitely recommend this palette because you could get very dramatic and almost leaning a little bit on the color colorful range if you wanted to, but you can also keep it super neutral with this palette or keep it lighter as well because there are so many different mattes to choose from. Cosmic Beauty, which used to be Cosmic Brushes, did release 2 palettes that they had the Nudetrals and then they had the Cooltrals. I'm actually not going to be showing you the Cooltrals because I don't think the Cooltrals is a neutral palette. It's just a bunch of blues in there. I'm going to be honest, it's a cool tone palette, but I don't think it's a neutral palette. This one though, that is called the Neutrals palette, this is definitely if you want to have a warm neutral palette with mostly browns but some different undertones, this one is an amazing palette. Quality is 10 out of 10. You get some multi-chromes in here, you get some duochromes in here, the foils are beautiful, the undertones are amazing, the mattes are, I love the Cosmic Beauty mattes. I think they are pigmented and blendable and buildable, and I even think the lighter ones are really pigmented. I overall just think they do a really good job with their palettes. And if you love a warm neutral palette, this does have some more cool tones, but it is leaning a little warmer. But if you love a neutral palette, this is stunning. It's truly stunning. And I think that if you are a person that only loves neutral palettes and you want to get into indie shadows, this palette will show you what it's all about. This palette will give you an insight into what people are talking about without having to refer to like reds and blues and greens. The other palette, here I am stretching it a little bit because I do think that the Undergrowth palette is a half neutral palette, especially if you have an olive undertone, but this definitely has more colors in it than the other one does. This I would say is a half neutral, half green palette, but a bunch of the greens are very muted. So again, depending on what you think, because I think a neutral can be so much more than a brown. There are so many more things that can be a neutral, but this I think is maybe stretching it a little bit too far, but I still wanted to mention it because I know a lot of people who only wear neutrals still wear greens. So maybe this one could be a great alternative. The last brand I am going to talk about is actually a brand that does quite a lot of neutral leaning color stories. They have a tendency of doing very interesting or like on the neutral side but still leaning into colors. I'm going to show you 4 different palettes from Nomad Cosmetics that I think are at least more than half of the shades are neutrals. Again, it's a brand that's perfect to start with if you don't want to have like just a rainbow palette, but you might want to have like a couple of colors. The first one is the Chicago Speakeasy palette. This one came out last year. This one has a couple of multi-chromes in the middle, so you get that like interesting shifty shade to work with, but it is warm browns. It is more like neutral, almost mauvey, cool leaning purpley shades, a little bit on the grayish side, and then there is a pop of green in the middle. But I would argue that most of the looks you would get from this palette, especially if you don't use the 2 greens in the middle, are gonna lean pretty neutral if that is something you're looking for and you are getting some more interesting shimmers in there. The next one is the Hudson Valley palette that Nomad came out with a couple of falls ago. This is beautiful. It's like this really nice matte paper feeling, and this one is very bright. Again, 2016 we would have said that this was a neutral palette because we really did think that red was a neutral. So it depends on like what do you think a neutral is, because this is very warm, but it is also like quite a lot of neutral shades and the greens are super muted, so definitely will not give a big pow on the lids. I would say that this is like, again, it's on the verge of like being a little bit more colorful, but it all depends on what you think is a neutral palette, and I think that this would like somewhat fit the prompt. Then we have the Okavango Safari palette. Again, this is definitely a very muted, a little bit more of a grungy, warmer brown with a row of like warmer greens. Again, I know green is not a neutral, but a lot of people who love neutrals also love green, so I thought I'd mention this one because I feel like it fits. Again, it fits the prompt. It's like an almost all neutral palette, but I still think that this one has more than 50% neutrals in there. And the last one I'm gonna mention is one of their best-selling palettes, I believe. I see so many people loving this palette. I think this is called Ghost Town USA. That's one of those where you can see it's a ghost town, and then it's like this really like just bright daytime western town. And this is definitely a cool tone color story. And again, there is blues here, but they're very muted, and I think that there is like more like neutral cool tone browns. There's some very, very muted olives over here. There's pretty neutral mattes here too. And then there's just a bunch of almost grays. On me, my skin tone, these are grays. Because it is so cool tone that on my skin tone, that's a little bit of a golden undertone. A lot of these will end up looking gray. So this is a pretty cool tone palette. If you have a cool skin tone, these will look a little brighter like blues. If you're like me and you have a warmer skin tone, a golden undertone, these will look a little bit more gray. But I think overall, a lot of people would still agree that this is borderline a neutral palette. Let me know if you agree with my picks or if you disagree with my picks. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Do you have any favorite like neutral palettes from indie brands that I did not mention in this video? Let me hear all about it. And also, what brand would you love to see come out with a neutral palette? I think it is time for Oden to come out with a neutral palette. I really think that that would do really good for the brand. I hope you're having a good day. Don't forget to subscribe before you leave, and I'll see you real soon in a new video. Bye!